Hello everyone and welcome to this video in which we will be reviewing the AP US Government FRQs. We're going to be going over the different types of questions you will run into on the FRQ portion of the AP Gov test, and we'll be going over some strategies as you answer those. And even as you're thinking about studying, maybe it's for your final exam, maybe it's for the AP test itself, what can you do to be as prepared as possible for these 4 FRQs? We're going to aim to cover that here in this video, so let's dive right in. And we'll kick things off with the bare necessities, the things you absolutely need to know. On the AP test itself, you will be expected to write in blue or black ink. And I know some of you have asked me this year. Yes, you do need to write neatly and legibly. If they cannot read your paper, they being the AP graders, who we're going to refer to a few times today, I mean, they cannot score your test, right? So if you're completing the test digitally, obviously this doesn't matter so much, but if you're handwriting it, you need to do your best to write as neatly and legibly as possible. Since you're using blue and black ink, you can just cross out anything that you don't want to keep. They'll ignore anything that has that strike through line. You're going to need to use complete sentences for all of these, particularly the argumentative essay. You can be docked points if you're not actually using complete sentences. You've got 100 minutes. There's 4 questions, and it's always the same 4 types of questions in the same order. You can go into this test pretty confident with what it's going to look like. When you open up that FRQ packet, you'll do the multiple choice first, the FRQ second. You should have a pretty good idea of at least the format of what those 4 questions are going to look like, and that's going to be a big portion of our time here today. Lastly, each question is worth 12.5% of your overall AP test score. This is important. All 4 FRQs are weighted equally. So even though the argumentative essay is worth more points than the scenario or application, they're actually weighted equally. What that means is that you don't need to worry, oh, I need to focus more on this one. Nope, all 4 of them are equally important into that final calculus of your AP score. So let's dive into those 4 different types of questions and spend some time thinking about what do we expect when we open up the textbook. What are the things they're really looking for here? Let's put it in normal people language, and then how can you study? So let's dive right into question 1. The question 1 is sometimes called, I sometimes call it the scenario question. The College Board refers to it as the concept application question. There's 3 points available here. And how they describe it is they say you're going to respond to a political scenario, explaining how it relates to a political principle, institution, process, policy, or behavior. Putting that in translation and normal people talk, we are going to connect something in the real world to a few concepts, terms, vocabulary, maybe from the AP US government class. You're going to have to talk intelligibly about something that's going on or has happened in the real world. Now, the AP test was just redesigned a few years ago, and that's when they unveiled all of these question types. And the very first question they ever released when they said, we're redesigning the AP test, was this one right here. It's the EpiPen question. This is extremely, extremely significant. And all the teachers, all the students wondering, what's the new AP test going to look like? And what's the first thing they reveal? It's a question about EpiPens, right? What's the point of that? Well, if you read the A, B, and C parts, you always get A, B, and C on the scenario question. You're going to learn it's not really about EpiPens. It's obviously about the interactions between the branches. However, that being said, they want to make sure you haven't just memorized the vocab. This was the first question ever released, and I think what it shows is that the College Board, the writers of the AP test, want to make sure you understand how the government actually works in the real world. Maybe you're presented with a scenario you've never thought about before. Year after this, the one they did was about Pulpit Freedom Day and pastors speaking their political beliefs from their churches and different interest groups' involvement with that. I mean, that's a complicated question, and it's probably something that 95% of the test takers hadn't thought about before. And so there's a real point they're trying to make here. Do you know your vocab? That's great. You're probably going to be very well off on the multiple choice, but can you apply it? Do you really understand how this is impacted by the branches of government? Or you see on Part C here, by linkage institutions. You look at Part A and B. When one branch like Congress does something, how can that be affected by the presidency? They want to give you a real world example for you to sort of explain how things really work. And so my biggest piece of advice with this is to make sure you're connecting back to the scenario in all three parts, A, B, and C, even if it feels forced. I often recommend, if you're not sure if you've done a good enough job showing how what you're talking about connects to the scenario, you can just add a sentence at the end of every part, A, B, and C. This connects to the scenario because yada, yada, yada. That's the biggest tip I can give you on that one. So how do you study for this? I mean, this is tough. They could quite literally ask you about anything going on in the world of government and politics. And if we look at some of the released questions, some of the questions that were on the AP exam in previous years, they like to ask about, things even like laws going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? So it's not all just current events we can study up on either. I have two big pieces of advice in this order. The first is, you can tell with this question, yes, they want to give you a scenario, but they're going to ask you about something where multiple branches are involved, or multiple linkage institutions even are involved. And so think about those things we've learned about in government class that involves multiple parts of the government. Two of the most common things they ask about in the concept application question are confirmation hearings, right? Where maybe the president is choosing someone to fill a role and the Senate can confirm them, and maybe they're on the Supreme Court, right? A third branch. And then the other thing is bureaucratic agencies, right? Those bureaucratic agencies, which are maybe overseen by Congress, they have that oversight power, but they're technically part of the executive branch. And maybe there's some budget considerations or a new policy or a new regulation. You can see how those topics lend themselves well to talking about these interactions between concepts. My second piece of advice for studying this is, hopefully all year long, you've been making sure that you've been watching the news, keeping up with current events, because just like they've asked about laws from the 70s and 80s, they've also asked about Trump's 2016 campaign. They've asked about a Supreme Court case last year on this question 1, a Supreme Court case from 2018 about Microsoft. So they can really hit some of those more recent in the news type things. And if you haven't been keeping up with current events, it's always a good idea to brush up on your government and politics from the last couple of years. Moving right along, question 2. This is the quantitative analysis question. You probably know it as the chart or graph question. College Board says you got to analyze quantitative data, identify a trend or pattern, draw a conclusion, and explain how the data relates to a principle, institution, process, policy, or behavior. Translating that, putting that in the normal people speak. Can you read the chart or graph in front of you, and can you connect it to some vocabulary that you've learned? This is a skill that you've been working on all year, whether you realize it or not, and reading those charts or graphs and making sure you can draw solid conclusions that are backed up by the vocabulary, the language of government, is what they're looking for here. Now, this is the first sample question they ever released about the quantitative analysis. And many of you have probably seen this question before. It's about per pupil spending by each state. And the question asked about federalism and different regions of the country, and what we can conclude from how federalism connects to public education spending. And so the biggest tip I can give you here, when we look at these, identify the most common level. B, sometimes B and C is split up. What's a similarity or difference? What's the conclusion? And then C, how does public education spending demonstrate, again, that bigger picture principle of federalism? The biggest hint I can give you here is that when you're looking at a chart or a graph, something you've been taught since probably middle school science is to always start by looking at the title of the chart or graph. The most common mistake people made on this is they didn't get, okay, this is about spent per pupil, right? So then maybe they got in trouble because they said some states are spending more or less than others, and that's not specific enough, right? Alaska is not spending the most on education. They're spending the most per pupil, but they obviously have way fewer pupils than Texas. And you say that's nitpicky. Well, that's reading a graph or chart. You do need to be specific and precise in your language. And the place to start that is going up here to the language of the title of the chart and using that to guide your way. Additionally, a question that seems to trip people up: draw a conclusion. When you're drawing a conclusion, you're explaining why or why it matters. When we say there's a similarity or difference in public education spending, you can't just say, and so my conclusion is that they're similar or different, right? You need to explain why that's going on, and it needs to be plausible, even if it doesn't have to be 100% correct. It needs to be plausible and justifiable based on what we see in the graph. Best way to study for these is what you've been doing all year. Look at those graphs, charts in your textbook. Just if you search, there's graphs and charts of the day. Many news sources will publish those. Be constantly, consuming this diet of pictorial representations of what's going on in our government. On to question 3. Question 3 is the Supreme Court case comparison. This one's just like question 2 out of 4 points. And College Board describes it as you compare a non-required Supreme Court case with a required Supreme Court case, explaining how information from the required case is relevant to that in the non-required one. That's a lot of required and non-required. What does that mean? You got to take 2 different cases and show how they are similar or different based on the Constitution. That last part is going to be very important here in just a minute. They're going to give you 2 cases. One of them you've seen before. One of them you haven't. We have that list of 15 court cases everyone's got to know. One of them is going to be from that list. One of them you're never going to have heard from it before. So the first tip here is don't freak out when they give you a couple paragraphs about a case you've never heard of before. That's actually the point. They want to see how well you can compare to this new case that maybe you just haven't thought of before. So the example, one of the samples on this was the town of Greece versus Galloway, and they compared this. Obviously, you'll see to Engel versus Vitale. Now, this is tricky because you can see here we've got constitutional clauses. We've got to say why is it different. We've got to, and then we got to kind of expand out, right? What should the public do if they disagree with the ruling in this case? So, there's a couple of things you need to do, but the first thing I would say is they give you a ton of information about this case. They're always going to give you, I would say, 1, 2, maybe even 3 paragraphs about this new case. And so read it carefully. And as you read, you should be getting an idea of which case you're going to compare it to. And hopefully you've got some facts, the constitutional clause, and a great deal of information about that other case so that you can really have a lot to say when it comes time here. Part B is the only part here worth 2 points. A and C are both worth 1 point. And part B, here's where you get 2 points, right? You got to explain the facts of Engel versus Vitale, not the ruling, not the reasoning, right? That's kind of part A is the constitutional clause. That's the reasoning. You got to give us some facts of Engel versus Vitale, and then they're going to tell you similar or different. Here they tell us different. Okay, based on those facts, what's different in these 2 cases? So it's, think of it as sort of find the similarity or difference. Maybe you remember those images from when you were a kid, right? Where there's 2 images and one of them, they're slightly different than the other and they're spotting the difference. It's kind of what you're doing here, only they're going to give you one image, Greece versus Galloway, and you're going to know about Engel versus Vitale, and you're going to have to try to spot the difference as to why these cases ended the way they did. So B should be your longest answer here. It's worth 2 points. C is where we expand out, right? Parts A and B are obviously all about the Supreme Court. And then in part C, we expand out. Here you can see, okay, what if you're a member of the public? What could you do if you disagree with the holding? So it's very important here you look closely at who they're asking you about, right? Maybe they could just as easily say, describe an action that Congress could take if they disagree. And obviously Congress is going to be able to maybe propose a constitutional amendment, but the public, they're not going to be able to just do that, right? You would maybe say something like members of the public could run for office. Members of the public could, yada, 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 and then explain how that could limit the impact of this case. My biggest tip here is that you need to know the constitutional clause by heart for every single one of these 15 cases. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. When you get to that question A, identify the constitutional clause. That should be the easiest question on the entirety of the AP test, because I see constitutional clause, I see Engel versus Vitale, and automatically I'm saying that's establishment clause, that I know I'm getting this point. There's no doubt about it. right? And part A, I mean, we're talking about, remember, every FRQ is 12.5%. That means it's 3-ish% per FRQ point. We're talking, that's something like 3 multiple choice questions just for knowing the constitutional clause. You got to get these ones. It's of tremendous importance to your success on the exam. So what do you study? You study those 15 cases, you know the constitutional clauses, you know the significance of the cases, and then maybe, once you've got those down, you start to just keep studying a few facts from each case. That way, when you get to that spot the difference question, or maybe it's explain why they're similar, you're able to really knock it out of the park. Finally, the big beast, the argumentative essay question, free response question 4. College Board describes it as this: develop an argument in the form of an essay using evidence from one or more required foundational documents. Putting that into normal people speak, what they're saying is this is a DBQ, right? And it's a document-based question. You've heard of DBQs before, probably in history. But instead of them giving you some documents, you have to know them ahead of time. In history, they'll give you a prompt, explain what caused the fall of the Roman Empire, for instance, and then maybe they'll give you 6 documents to choose from in building your argument, and you've got to build, a solid argument. And this is the same way. They're giving you a prompt, but they don't give you the documents. You've been studying the documents all year. And so they give you some hints on how to do that, right? You need a claim or a thesis. You need 2 pieces of accurate and relevant evidence or information. You got to use reasoning, and reasoning is a fancy way of saying that throughout your whole essay, there's a clear argument that I can follow as the grader, as the reader. Your thesis clearly matches up with your evidence. Your evidence obviously supports your thesis, and there's no question about that. And then you have to offer a rebuttal, right? You have to say, well, there are other positions out here. Some people might say this for reasons X, Y, and Z, but here's why I would disagree. And we'll give you some terms to help cue that. Now, one piece of advice here is to have your go-to documents. If this is a document-based question, of course, you are welcome to use evidence, really any specific piece of material from the course, whether that's a Supreme Court case, whether that's a constitutional clause, whether that's a law, whether that's a specific institution or process within the class we've studied. But the documents, these prompts are written so that they can be answered and supported with the documents. And the ones that people tend to write about the most are probably Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. I would say those are very good ones to use, but I would also toss in the Declaration of Independence in there, right? Almost certainly you're going to be able to say something about the Declaration of Independence and how it's the foundation of our country even before the Constitution, that whole idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and inalienable rights. Or you're going to be able to say something about factions competing. Federalist 10, a large republic. It's an argument for why we should have the Constitution. So Federalist 10 is anytime we're talking about why the constitutional system is good. And Federalist 51 is, more of the same, right? The Federalist 51, all about that system of checks and balances between the branches. Very famously, Federalist 51, if men were angels, government would not be necessary. The whole quotes idea being, we have government, but it's run by people. And so those people, just like the people of our country, need some rules and some limitations on them. Now, the first prompt they ever released for this is one that you've certainly seen, and that's to develop an argument that explains which of the 3 models of representative democracy, participatory, pluralist, or elite, best achieves the founder's intent for American democracy. And this is rather tricky because you might read that and you might really hone in on the participatory, pluralist, elite, and you're like, I know those terms, but it's important to recognize what the question's really asking. And yes, it is about these 3, but it's not about what you think is best. It's about the founder's intent. And that could be a contentious term, right? Who are the founders, right? Is it the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Is it the people who wrote the Constitution? Does it include the anti-federalists? And that may be a term, the founders, that you decide, I need to have an introduction where I sort of define this term and set it up for that. They're going to use a lot of vocabulary in your in your argumentative essay prompt. As you can see here, I see, participatory, pluralist, elite, founders, representative, democracy. Those are 5 terms that, I need to be pretty comfortable with if I'm going to write the best possible essay. So how do I recommend you approach this? Well, the first thing is they will give you 3 recommended documents, and you need to use at least one of them. And as you do that, what I would say is start off by mentally positioning each document. Oh, what does Federalist 10 support here? What does Brutus 1 support here, right? Think about that. Think about how you could use that evidence. As you're writing, you're going to want to underline that thesis. Make sure there is no question in the grader's mind as to what your thesis is. And then when you get to the end, I recommend that your concluding paragraph is maybe your rebuttal. Maybe you kick that off and you cue it. It's very obvious. Again, you're doing all the hard work for the grader. Some might argue blah, 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 because blah, 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 blah. However, this is incorrect because yabba dabba do. And so I would recommend you really think about these 3 tips. They tend to, if you can position those documents, if you know which side they all kind of support before you go in, that's great. If you underline your thesis, you prevent, a grader from missing it. If you cue your rebuttal, that's a really easy point to make sure that you get in this argumentative essay. Now, just a couple last slides here. The first one is a process slide. The second is a last thoughts slide. But this slide just sort of serves if you really are struggling with this whole FRQ thing, and we've been through all 4 of them now, but you're still not really sure how this should look, you can come back to this slide and maybe try a few practice FRQs with this slide up. It'll just walk you through the process and a couple of highlights here. I highly recommend outlining your response before starting, and then when you write, keeping your sentences very, very simple. You want to write more rather than less. Short answers will hurt you more than long ones. Did you actually answer the prompt? This is important. And while grammar, spelling, and punctuation aren't going to count against you, they do sort of make your essay look a little bit less professional. And the reason why that's important is because the grader is going to spend less than 2 minutes, fewer than 2 minutes reading this. And so you need to give the best possible impression that you can. And that also means that, you're timing yourself well and you're able to move on quickly and efficiently through these FRQs. A few final thoughts. These are maybe a bit more just my take. If I was taking this test, what are the things I would be thinking of? First off, I would highly recommend you label the different parts of your answer. In other words, in the first 3 questions, question 1, question 2, question 3, there are parts A, B, C, and sometimes D. So for me, I think if you want to help the grader out as much as possible on those, you need to label parts A, B, C, and D. I get on you guys when you don't do this because it makes it harder to tell where your answers are. If you are really worried about this, you can say, well, what if I accidentally answer something from A in part B and then I don't get I can understand that fear. Still, I would recommend that don't label, but space them out so I can clearly see here's where A is, here's where B is, here's where C is. Make sure you're paying close attention to the verbs in each question. Identify is obviously pretty short. It can be answered in a couple of words. Describe is a little bit longer. Explain probably needs an example or a very, very in-depth why, a very in-depth process that you're going into. That's an important word. And explain is really the highest bar you'll see here on the FRQ test. And then there's that draw conclusion phrase we came up against earlier, right? It's not enough to just restate the similarity or difference. You've got to explain why that's going on. In many ways, draw a conclusion is a similar bar to explain. It's just more connected to when we're talking about the data in the chart. I recommend that after you're done writing, you get rid of all your pronouns. When you use words like them, their, it, or its, this makes your writing less clear. Now, we use pronouns to try to make our writing less repetitive, but in this case, it is okay if your writing is repetitive. You want it to be as clear as possible. In other words, imagine if I'm saying, this affects the interaction between Congress and the president because they can veto a law. Well, it's really not clear that I know what I'm talking about. Who is it that can veto the law? Is it Congress or is it the president? You might instead say this impacts the interaction between Congress and the president because the president can veto laws passed by Congress. Get rid of those pronouns. Be as clear as possible. Lastly, when they ask you for an action, Don't say, well, the members of the public could say, members of the public could bring this up, members of the public could discuss or mention. These are not actions, right? When they talk about what's an action a member of the public or a member of Congress could take, they're talking about specifically something they would do, not just something they would say. And that's another common mistake where right there in the question, they're asking you for an action, and then you give them one of these words like say or bring it up. And with that, well, look at the time. We've been here too long. I've taken up too much of your time. Let's just have one final reminder about the timing of the AP Gov FRQs. It's 100 minutes total. And how that's split up is they want you to take 20 minutes for FRQ 1, 2, and 3, and 40 minutes for FRQ 4. You may want to decide your strategy for yourself now. Is it a better idea to start with the essay, go straight to that FRQ 4 to make sure you get the best essay you can? Or is it a better idea to leave it for the end? Maybe FRQ 2 and 3 go a little bit quicker for you and you bank an extra 10 minutes and so you have 50 minutes for the essay. Maybe you're like, I know once I do the essay, my hand is going to be sore, so I want to put it in a different spot. You want to think about these things beforehand and not just go in, psych yourself out, start on one, move to another. I would recommend moving through them in order, with only one exception being maybe if you're really freaked out about that essay, instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, doing 4, 1, 2, 3. But either way, you have 100 minutes total and you get to use that as you please. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope that this was helpful for you. Please feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. And I wish you the absolute best of luck as you're getting ready for these final FRQs. We'll see you later.